This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Well, I'm Richie Kohler, and this is Evan Kovacs, so I'm the good-looking one, and he's the younger one. So I want to thank Dawn and all of our sponsors for having us here today, and of course thank all of you guys for braving the storm, which almost prevented us from not attending. Both Evan and myself live in beautiful Massachusetts, and I can't believe that the weather's actually nicer there than it is here in Florida. But fortunately, we weren't diverted to Fort Lauderdale. We were able to get here and be here for our presentation this evening, which is about two of our most recent underwater explorations. One of a ship whose very name has become synonymous with tragedy and disaster, and the other of what is arguably the greatest technical achievement of mankind, the Apollo moon landing. I first met Evan over 30 years ago as sport divers. What we did was explore shipwrecks and caves, at times looking for historic artifacts or dinner, which I always like doing myself. But our real passion was to search for the elusive virgin or undiscovered shipwreck. Evan and I like to do the same thing, but we do it differently. He is a really, really big cave diver. He loves coming here to Florida and other places, and I'm a cave diver as well, but I don't have the same drive that he does for going into caves. I find that the wet rocks at the back of the cave look like the wet rocks at the front of the cave. But there's a lot of energy expended to get all the way back there, you know? But I understand his sense of adventure and wanting to do that. And yes, there are very significant finds. I mean, quite often, not only are some of them archaeological. Recently in Mexico, one of the oldest fossilized human remains in the Americas was located by cave divers. So there is significant things to be located. I just personally like being out in the ocean where it's not as a static environment as the caves. So our type of diving, or the diving that Evan and I do, is far from the recreational dive profile that many of you probably are familiar with, or at least have seen on television. It's beyond normal. We go extremely deep, sometimes over 400 feet, and that is outside the realm of sport diving. It requires that we wear complex exposure suits, in some cases, as you see in this image, full face masks. We're breathing gases other than air, many times. Gases that would not support life on the surface are what were required for us at great depth. So there's a great deal of complexity balancing the mixtures of these gases as we're going through the water column. Add to that we're also using closed circuit rebreathers, which is a device that captures your exhausted breathing, circles it around, scrubs out the carbon dioxide, and allows you to stay under the water over 24 hours. Where a scuba tank would run out of gas, this will allow us to stay alive regardless of depth for about 24 hours. So as you can see, even going into the water, we look very different than a normal sport diver, and we have, from our equipment base, more in common with astronauts than we do with sport divers. Now, this was a hobby for us. Each of us coughed up our own dollars and would do this on the weekend. I, at that time, was still working in my family's glass business based out of Brooklyn, New York. And Evan was working off-Broadway doing lighting for plays when our hobby was about to change our lives. And that event was about a shipwreck. In the fall of 1991, a previously unknown and undiscovered German U-boat was thrust into our lives. It would take 6 years for us diving this wreck to figure out what no government, no historian, or no expert could figure out. Simply, what U-boat was this? Well, one of the things we found out quickly was that it was a World War II German U-boat when artifacts were recovered from the shipwreck with the eagle and swastika in the year 1942. We also found out that on board was the crew, a 56-man crew, where they had fallen. They were still in their uniforms, half buried in the silt, just skeletal remains, but it was obvious that this was a war loss. It was dangerous diving at the time, 230 feet deep, 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. During that time, tragically, 3 of our team would die, 2 of them a father and son, in order to figure out this mystery. But when we did figure out this mystery, one of the things that I did was go to Germany and meet with the families and tell them not what they didn't know. They knew that their loved ones didn't come home at the end of the war. What we were able to do was to tell them what had happened to them and where they were. And so, in a way, we provided some degree of closure. Well, this story was big. It was big international news, and people took notice. One was an author named Robert Kurson, who wrote what would become a New York Times best-selling book, Shadow Divers. And folks at A&E Television also took notice of the story and offered both Evan and I a job working on what then would become a hit television show called Deep Sea Detectives. Over 4 years, we produced 56 hours of television. That was 56 episodes, 1-hour episodes, plus a number of standalone documentary films. So our passion and our hobby, our sense of purpose and direction, changed our life. And our hobby now became our vocation. And one of the things that you get when you work for television, people calling you up all the time with fantastic ideas. They've got great ideas for you to do a television show. Some of them weren't really that great, but one day we got an offer we couldn't refuse. We got an opportunity to go what was arguably the greatest shipwreck in history. A person who had worked for the company RMS Titanic, who was salvaging the wreck, had called us up and said that on one of his missions, far, far away from the wreck, he saw mysterious twisted pieces of metal. He thought that these pieces of metal may actually be the moment, the smoking gun, if you will, when Titanic had struck the iceberg, and that these pieces of steel had peeled off. And if we went out there and identified those pieces of steel, well, then we would be the people to conclusively prove why Titanic sank so quickly that night. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell everybody here. I'm positive each of you know the story of Titanic. It is a tragic tale of an iconic ship of dreams that sinks on its maiden voyage, taking 1,500 people to an early grave. And I think the thing that strikes all of us about it is that it hit the wealthiest tycoons and the poorest of immigrants equally. And I think the other thing about Titanic that just resonates through time is that it didn't sink in a storm or a tempest. It actually sank on a quiet, beautiful night. The stars were out and the ocean was flat as glass. It was nearly a non-event. And even the sinking itself was so painfully slow, occurring over 3 hours. And people made their decisions that night. Do I get out of the big boat and get into the lifeboat? Or do I stay inside where it's warm? There wasn't enough lifeboats on the Titanic for nearly half of the people on board, and yet the lifeboats that did leave weren't even full. People made decisions based on the fact that the ship was sinking so slowly, and that they had been told that only 3 hours away was their sister ship, the RMS Carpathia, which was steaming to them at full speed, or as fast as it can go through the ice floes to get there to rescue them, which never came. The opportunity for us to go and visit this wreck came at a very big cost. We were going to charter this vessel, the Academic Mstislav Keldysh, a Russian-built vessel at 400 feet long with a crew of 125. Its sole purpose was the support and maintenance of 2 Mir, which is, the word Mir means peace in Russian, submersibles. At the time, the Mirs and only 2 other submersibles in the world were capable of exploring Titanic. And this kind of technology comes at a great price. The price for this vessel for 2 weeks was only $350,000. And the reason why it was so inexpensive was that the month before, James Cameron had been using it to film Ghost of the Abyss. So because he had already paid the freight for it to wind up in Newfoundland, we got to get the vessel at a bargain price of $300,000. So when we tried to tell this story to our folks at A&E, they loved it until they heard the price of the charter. Then they didn't like it so much. But if there's one thing you'll learn about Evan and I and our partners is that we never back away from a challenge. So we begged our wives, we mortgaged our houses, and we came up with the money to charter the Keldysh. And when you get the Keldysh, of course, you get the Mir submersibles. And as I mentioned to you earlier before, that as a young man growing up, the fact that as I climbed into this Russian submarine and I'm wearing a Nomex flight suit with our mission patch on one arm, the American flag on the other, and my name across my heart, I looked out on the deck. There's 125 people. The crew are dressed in different color uniforms depending on what their mission is on board the Keldysh. And the parallels between space flight and deep ocean exploration weren't lost on me. My heart was beating inside my chest. And I was incredibly excited and happy that my wife let me have the money so I could do it. But by the way, it came with another price because she didn't let me do it if she got to go as well. So my wife was one of the few women who's had also the opportunity to go on the trip. Now the Mir submersibles are quite unique in that they have on board unique propulsion systems, sonar systems, as well as high definition cameras, all in a 6-inch nickel sphere that on the inside is only about 2.5 meters. That's before you put in 3 fat guys and all the equipment that you need. So that's what the space that you have for what could be between a 16 or 24-hour mission. Now, the descent down to Titanic takes about 2.5 hours, and when you get inside the Mirs, they're incredibly hot because they've been charged up, they've been sitting on the deck of the Keldysh, and of course you've got to wait for both of them to be launched because the Russian program is that they launch 2 submarines every time. That is a safety factor, so that if one submarine had a problem, the other one can come to its aid. For us as filmmakers, it's fantastic as well because it gives us a subject to put into the scale. It allows them to do lighting, and of course now you're covering twice the area you could with just one submarine. I was teamed up with then veteran and unfortunately the late Ralph White, who was actually there with Bob Ballard when Titanic was found. He was one of the first people to image it, and as one of the founding finders or discoverers of the wreck, he has probably made more dives and had more time on Titanic than even Captain Smith of the Titanic. That's how many missions he had been. So I was honored to have him, as my cameraman. And as we're descending to the bottom, he's, as I don't know if we have any bubbleheads or submariners or submariners here in the room, but he's telling me about, oh, don't worry, Richie, if the submarine breaks, you're never going to know it. It's just going to crush you to death, and don't. So I'm like, okay, I'm cool. I'm not going to freak out. Well, as we're making our way to the bottom, the first thing that the Russian pilot, in my case on this mission was Genya, tells you is don't touch nothing. He says, but look here, and I look, and there's a number, and it says 0.21, which I understand is the percentage of oxygen in the inside of the Mir. He says, if this number changes, wake me up. So, and he goes to sleep because they shut down all the lights, they shut down all the power, and you're falling through the water column 2.5 miles. And it takes 2.5 hours to get to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So of course, the first 20 minutes, I'm all like, wow, what's this? I'm like, didn't touch anything, but I'm looking at everything. And I notice that right next to where it said 0.21 was another device, looked just like it, but there was wires hanging out and it wasn't lit up. So I go, Genya, what? What's going on? It's broken, don't worry. I'm like, I paid $300,000 for a broken submarine. So as we get near the bottom, all of a sudden Genya wakes up. We're woken. I couldn't fall asleep, but we're disturbed from our slumber by topside giving us the heads up that we're getting close to the bottom. So Genya wakes up. He starts turning on the lights and he starts piloting by sonar towards the wreck. So now I'm waiting for this moment that I obviously, since the idea came to us, that I'm going to peer through this 6-inch thick, 4-inch diameter cone of quartz and look out across the water and see Titanic. So Ralph White, my cameraman, he's there. He's got the camera going on. Of course, I'm working for the History. I'm hoping I'm going to be working for the History Channel if they buy the program. And I'm peering out into the blackness when all of a sudden this shock of cold water hits me right in the back of the head, and I smack my face into the portal, and I turn around and there's Ralph White with a water gun. So that is a behind-the-scenes real deal of what goes on these incredible missions. But the reality is fantastic. Words cannot describe the feelings of emotion, and I don't want to say pride because that would be hubris, but the reality of what we've accomplished to be able to go down to the bottom of the Atlantic and see something that has rested for over 100 years undisturbed and waited for us. And of course, the enormity of the tragedy itself. The water is cold, but you're also realizing that around you are the souls. This is the resting place of 1,500 people. So there is a somberness to it. At the same time, you have your excitement as an underwater explorer, and you recognize that Evan and I have been exploring many shipwrecks. And one of them has been referred to as the Mount Everest. That's the Andrea Doria that sunk off of Massachusetts in 1956, taking 50 people to a grave after being struck by the Stockholm in a collision going to the bottom. Because of the difficulty of the getting out to the site and making the dive, and also the fact that 30 divers have died over the last 40 years diving the Andrea Doria, they call it the Mount Everest. Well, as I'm staring out at this, I realize that if diving the Andrea Doria had been the Mount Everest, then truly for me, going to Titanic was like going to the moon. As we make our way down the side of the shipwreck, you can see the first-class cabins, and you can actually see how they're twisted from the striking, how the ship hit the bottom at 120 miles an hour, twisting even the windows and bulkheads into a oblique form. Coming back up, we can see where the bronze helm or steering station was on the bridge, and behind that, Captain Smith's cabin with his personal bathtub, which surprisingly, after 100 years, still holds water. Come on, a little levity, all right? So as we make our way, our purpose was to go and find these pieces of steel, but instead what we had found as we traveled further and further away from the wreck, actually hundreds of meters away from the main body, we came across these large sections of ship that no one had ever saw or imaged before. And we realized that what we were looking at was quite unique. You could actually still see the red anti-fouling or anti-fouling paint on the bottom of it and a slight bilge keel. And as we come around, we realized that it had these freeing ports or limber holes in it, and we're looking at it and going, oh my gosh, this is the actual bottom of the ship. The bottom of the ship had broken away and was far away from the main wreckage. So we videoed it, we took pictures of it, we sketched it, and then we went to a noted marine artist named Ken Marshall, who took our sketches and put together an actual diagram of what we had imaged. And so when we see these two pieces, we actually see that they fit together, and they comprise a 100-foot wide, because that was the beam or the width of the Titanic, was 100-foot wide from port to starboard, and almost an 80-foot length of the bottom of the ship. And what we couldn't figure out is why it was where it was and why it had broken away, but we're not engineers, we're explorers. So we go to engineers and ask them the questions. And what happens is they come to us and they go, well, what you've found is called a double bottom. And these areas where it would be, you can actually see in this cutaway of one of the Titanic sister ships, Olympic. You can see how it was on the bottom. And that what this really meant is that the breakup and sinking of Titanic wasn't as what we had thought. Most people had believed, prior to us discovering and imaging these sections of the ship, was that Titanic had filled with water and then started to sink and broke up as it was sinking. These pieces proved it was actually different. What happened is Titanic for 3 hours filled with water, and then due to the stress of half of the ship being negative or filled with water and the back half being buoyant, it couldn't handle the stress, and these two pieces of the bottom of the ship broke away right underneath the engine room and flitted away to the bottom. So at that moment, Titanic had become a shipwreck, and at that moment, she was lost. In other words, all of her buoyancy was gone, and she was going straight to the bottom. So the people who had stayed on board, those people who had waited, those people who were hoping that Carpathia would make it, the minute that those two pieces broke away, all hope was lost. Now, in order to find these pieces, we had to go far away, and this is an actual plot of our mission, and you could see the bow section and the stern section, which are nearly a mile apart. And then in the blue lines, you can see where we found the two pieces, how far away they were from the main body of the wreck, which indicated that before the bow or the stern sank, these two pieces actually fell down. So if you would, this was the moment that Titanic had broken apart and became a shipwreck by those two small blue X's where these pieces fell to the seafloor. And as you can see, our work was really outside of the box of where most of previous expeditions have ever gone looking before.
So one of the things that 2005 proved unequivocally was that this box was just small and not really known. And at that point, over 20 years after it was originally found, the best map was still a hand-drawn map that was done over 85 through 87. And it was ultimately, made a little bit nicer, but it was still based on a hand-drawn map, on exploration done with Alvin in the early 80s. So in 2010, when RMS Titanic came to us up at Woods Hole and said, we want to get back out there, but we want to do some real science. We're not going to go out and salvage. What can we do? Unequivocally, everybody across the board said, we need to do a map. We need to know where Titanic is and where she isn't. And in that sense, once we get the big picture, we'll understand it. We'll know the context. We will know where everything is, and we can start putting it all together like a big crime scene. And that's exactly what we set out to do. So in 2010, we did the mapping survey and did the first nested survey of Titanic. And what a nested survey means is that we start big. We start with a 30-mile bathymetry box, and we keep drilling down. We go out with AUVs, or autonomous underwater vehicles, and do continually smaller and higher resolution boxes so that ultimately we know exactly where everything is. We know where the last piece and the first piece of Kohler, we know where all of the boilers, we know where all of the debris is, and we can see visually exactly where it's at. And for a lot of people, that was able to give them the information, the data they needed to really start piecing it together and do the first real archaeological report in over 20 years. And so what we're looking at here is a bit of the map. This is the stern section, and what we did is we used acoustic imagery to do sort of the broad scope, and then we went back with optical, with cameras, and started mowing the lawn and building out the map. And this map is such that you could start literally up in the sky and zoom all the way in to look at something like a boiler. You could count rivets. You could see a dish and read the name of the ship if it was actually on the dish. But one of the reasons that this was so important to people, as I mentioned, was context. And when you're doing things in the bottom of the ocean, one of the things that people don't really tend to grasp is the fact that you really can only see a small little section at a time. There's a great analogy that people use, and they say it's like going to New York City at night when there's no power, all the lights are out, and somebody gives you a pen light, and you've never been to New York City, and they're like, all right, explore the city and draw a map. Kind of hard to do, but that's what it was like, and that's what it is like working in the bottom of the ocean. So as cool as this was, and as fascinating as it was for all of us involved, my personal interest was in imagery, creating imagery and building imagery to show people what Titanic really looked like, what she looked like, and at that point, many people thought, they had a good image, they had a good idea because we had some fantastic video. We've had great artist renditions like Ken Marshall, who went out there and painstakingly painted paintings and graphics and schematics and all sorts of stuff that really showed it the way it was. But we wanted to use real imagery and show it like it had never been seen before. So we went and started doing mosaics of the site. And not just mosaics like had been done in the early 80s, where it was a top-down. It's like a plane flying over everything. We wanted to see what she looked like from the sides. And each of these mosaics is approximately 3,000 images that took us about 6 months to put together, but shows Titanic as she really lies now. And what's cool about it is that you can actually zoom in and find the name. You can see crabs. You can see little things that are going on. And what's even better is that there is some imagery from the 80s and early, from the 80s when it was discovered, that we can go back and start to look at it temporally and discover what she's doing now, 25 to 30 years after discovery. And that's been a lot of fun. Now, this is an image that very few people ever get to see. This is the stern section of Titanic. We're looking at the starboard side, and as divers, it looks it looks a little off. It feels a little weird. And that's partially because, unlike the bow, the stern of Titanic was where all the damage. There was lots of implosions and lots of explosions, and the thing just peeled open. And so where it starts closest to us, that's like almost 50 feet out. So we're looking at stuff that it's a two-dimensional image of something that really is three-dimensional, which is really why ultimately we need to go back and build this out in a three-dimensional model, like with photogrammetry, things like that. Then you'll really be able to understand and conceptualize the way this lays. But what's kind of cool is we were able to go and do shots like this. Now these are two engines right smack in the middle, and you know, they're 5 stories across. It's approximately 80 feet wide, and if you look down in the lower left-hand corner, this is where the sections that we found in 2005 actually fit right in. And one of my favorite shots that we were able to do was this. It's the stern, the poop deck, the stern of Titanic, and it's a beautiful shot that, again, you can never see when you go there, and whether you look at it with an ROV or out the porthole, and it's just, to me, it captures something. But it was shots like this that sort of got me out there a little bit, and people noticed it and said, wow, that's pretty amazing. I mean, Evan did some great stuff. And you know, one of the things to remember is that for every shot like this, there's 50 or 60 people that support it to make it happen. You've got ship's crew, you've got other people running vehicles, you've got processing that's done. So, I mean, we get to stand up and often talk about it and say the fun stuff about it, but so many people go into making all this happen. But regardless, in 2013, I got an invitation to what to this day is still one of the seminal parts of my career. Now, some of you guys in the room probably saw this in real time. This is the Apollo 11 moon launching mission. It took place in 1969, approximately 4 years and 340 some odd days before I was born. But even, since then, it was such an important event like that. We used to watch it, my parents, they were constantly talking about the moon mission, and they just drilled this like fascination and interest into me about space and the moon. And I watch this, and even watching it now, I find it amazing that I get to play a very, very small part in telling the history of the Apollo 11 moon launching. So, I mean, Apollo 11, obviously one of the greatest technical achievements that humankind has been able to make. And to this day, we still get chills thinking about people actually walking on the moon. I mean, we're trying to get back there to some extent now, something that was done, nearly 50 years ago. But in 1969, there were a lot of people sitting around the TV watching it, and there was one little boy, 5 or 6 years old, watching it, and to this day, he credits that whole mission, that launch, where he sat around and felt the excitement with his family all around him, his neighbors, and he credits it to turning him into the person that he is today, and that's Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon.com. And as he became a successful person, he decided, I want to go out and I want to rekindle that excitement. I want to get people, I want to get kids, I want to get the next generation of explorers, of underwater explorers, of astronauts, of just people that want to go out and see what's there. I want to inspire them by giving them a little bit of the Apollo 11 history. And that's basically what he did. He put together a team of which I was fortunate enough to be a part to go out and find the Saturn V rocket that put men on the moon. Now, the Saturn V rocket, again, probably a lot of you guys know this, but it's made up of 5 F1 engines. The F1 engine was, to this day, still the most powerful liquid fuel rocket engine, 1.5 million pounds of thrust, and it burned 4 tons of fuel per second, which is just under 4,000 gallons per second, and it burned for 165 seconds. So that's under 3 minutes. And under 3 minutes, it launched it 38 miles into the atmosphere. This is a little diagram of what the F1 engine looks like. And we've been kind of working in the ocean for a while. And we knew that we weren't probably going to find this. You know, like what NASA was awesome at, and is awesome at, they could put something up in the atmosphere with pinpoint accuracy. But at that point, the rest of the rocket was pretty much expendable, and they didn't really care too much about where it ended up, other than to say, you don't want to be in this 100-mile section of ocean right now. Next week, you really don't want to have your ships going through there. There's some great stories about ships that missed that and got hit with a little bit of space junk, space debris. But one of the things that's cool, and my last little fun fact about the Saturn V rocket, is that the peak output was 60 gigawatts of energy. That's the equivalent of approximately 85 Hoover dams. That's a lot of power. So NASA, like I said, they were great. They put it up there. They would say, okay, somewhere out there, don't be there. And they never expected to ever, see these things again. So they really didn't pay a heck of a lot of attention. But now, 30, 40 years later, had to go back and find the various pieces. So they went out, they got a ship, they went out with synthetic aperture sonar and traditional side scan sonar, and had there's a whole story behind that, which will probably hopefully be a book someday. But they went out, they searched 180 square miles and found a lot of targets. And what was awesome was that the targets, so a Saturn V rocket had 5 F1 engines, 1 in the center and 4 on the outside. And as they went through and looked at these different areas, and each of these areas more or less corresponded to where NASA said, well, Apollo 10 mission was there, Apollo 13 was there, Apollo 11 was there, and it happened to correspond. There would be 5 relatively large blips that looked like 5 engines. So we were like, man, those guys, they were really good. And so with all of this information, we went out to find them, document them, and eventually bring them up. But for people that haven't really seen what side scan and stuff like that looks like, and what exactly does that mean, this is what you get. And this is what people analyze and say, oh, okay, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that looks like 5 engines. The guys that analyze this at Williamson were phenomenal. And I mean, I can see, the seafloor and some shiny bits and bobs, but I would never pick that out to be a bunch of engines. So those guys deserve a round of applause. But what we did, unlike our Titanic mission, is that we went out and we were going to be using robots. This was almost 3 miles underwater, so it's deeper, substantially deeper than Titanic. And the reality was, and the reality is, with human-occupied vehicles and submarines, as much as I love them and I'm a big proponent, you have a limited amount of time. You're limited by the human interface in that case. You need to eat, you need to use the bathroom, and you need to breathe. So the subs are only going to get 8 to 12 hours of bottom time. In this situation, the robots made a lot more sense. So with ROVs, we could go down and basically spend days, sometimes weeks, without even coming up. This particular ship, this group, Swire Seabed, one of the best in the world, and we used the Schilling ROVs, again, some of the best in the world. Just for reference, these ROVs, they go down to the bottom of the ocean on a cable. And then that little spot up there on the top where those guys are, that's called the TMS, or the Tether Management System. And that actually houses a neutral tether. So that will hang off the ship while the vehicle will go off and do its thing. And what the importance of that is that this ship, and one of the reasons we wanted to go with Swire Seabed, was the fact that they could operate in 3 to 4 meter seas. And you definitely can't do that with a lot of other vehicles and also with a lot of other submarines. Part of the reason we were able to do that was that tether management system disassociated the movement of the ship with the vehicle. So the vehicle could remain beautifully calm, steady. It could recover delicate artifacts. It could take beautiful images, while meanwhile we're on the surface being tossed around like beans. And then the other big thing was that we could actually descend down through the middle of the ship in a moon pool, which is pretty neat. Now, again, unlike the submarine where you're looking through a little hole like this, Here, we get to sit back, we have luxury chairs, we have lots of monitors, lots of cameras, and that allows us to do these extended operations. But this is essentially what a pilot station looks like. You've got a pilot, a co-pilot, and off to the right, a bunch of monitors so we can actually watch the high-def feeds. Now, anybody that's done work or ever done a search in the ocean, how long does it take when you get down there to find something? It's not minutes. It's often not hours. Sometimes it's days, it's weeks. Sometimes you never find things. But in this case, we had some great information from the guys that did the sonar. We also had some excellent navigation from the ship. And within 5 minutes, literally, of hitting the ground, we came across this. And we're like, wow, well, that's not natural. That's obviously space debris. And that was pretty cool. So we're like, well, I guess we're on the right spot. And within 30 minutes, we found our first thrust chamber, our first F1 engine. And I can tell you, high fives all around. It was great. It was awesome. And we're like, all right, let's go look around. We've got 5 blips here. We're going to find more. And so we did. We kept going around. We found another thrust chamber. And just so for reference, just the thrust chamber, that's kind of like the meat and the potatoes of the engine for the most part. Whoop, sorry about that. That went through. But that's the part that basically makes it all move. But what happened was we found a whole bunch of them, and they were in this little lawn dart sort of configuration. Anyway, we're in the Apollo 11 area. We get out there, we find all these engines. We're like, all right, well, let's start looking at them. So we literally got out the brushes and started cleaning them to find the serial numbers and make sure that we had the Apollo 11 engine. And the first one we found was I think Apollo 13. Like, okay, well, that's different. We weren't expecting that. Well, Apollo 13 is pretty cool anyway. So we start doing another one like, oh, this is Apollo 8. And, well, this one doesn't even have a number. And we spent several weeks at that, several days anyway, over the course of a couple of weeks, going around and searching and looking and trying to find numbers on these things. And at the end of the day, we found beautiful pieces, but never actually found an Apollo 11 engine. And this, I just like, because everybody's familiar with the rocket. This is the cowling, the lower cowling from a rocket. You can see the black, you can see the white paint, the black stripe, and this is a small little mosaic that we put together. One of the real beautiful parts, we sort of likened it to a sculpture garden, a modern sculpture garden, because this stuff was just twisted and somehow beautiful, because it wasn't covered, it wasn't encrusted, it wasn't rusted, it still shined and was gorgeous. And this was actually the nozzle extension. This is the very bottom of the engine, and that's what it tended to look like. So show a little video here, just so you can see kind of, they're quick clips, but what these things look like when we found them on the bottom. But there was something really profound and beautiful there, and I could have spent, days. I'd still be there filming them because they were so beautiful, so pretty. But at the end of the day, we were there to recover engines. And so even though we didn't find anything from Apollo 11, we decided we'd recover a series of these thrust chambers, bring them up, and then enough other pieces like the heat exchangers, the nozzle extensions, so that we could essentially have one complete engine. Now, this is another short little video about some of the recovery and how we actually recovered it. Now, one of the cool things is, you've got these thrust chambers and they're buried in the mud. They're dirt darts. They're right in there. And we didn't want to just try to rip them out because it would damage them further. So we took what's called a dredge, or really an underwater vacuum cleaner, and sucked all the mud away. And that was something that literally you could go to breakfast, take a nap, come back in the afternoon, and it would still be going on. It's a slow process. And so we would go down, we'd remove all of the dirt, and ultimately start rigging them up. Now, one of the reasons we went with this company, Swire, was they are one of the best in deep water salvage operations. And essentially, we've got 2 vehicles and a giant basket hanging on single cables 3 miles down under the ocean. Never had an incident, never had a problem. These guys were unbelievable. And so what we did, though, I'm like, oh, wow, how are we going to recover this? Or, build something special? Like, oh, no, we'll just get a couple of slings, sling it through, quite literally, sling it through the middle of the chamber, use the crane on the ship to pick it up, and then use the ROV to drive it over and put it into these custom baskets. And these baskets were pretty wild. They were purpose-built to go and protect them. They had kind of like a net on the bottom, so it would absorb any bounce. It wouldn't allow the things to really crash into each other. And at the end of the day, we brought stuff up to the surface, and this is what we did. The crane operators, if you ever get a chance to see anything like these crane operators are unbelievable. Because the first day when our first thing came up was actually the middle of the night. We had a 4 to 5 foot sea, which wasn't terrible, but it's still big, you know. And we're tossing around, and these crane guys, they sit there and you're like, wow, are they really going to do this? And especially for the first operation, you know, Jeff and his family are out there, the whole expedition team's out there, you know, the ROV pilots are out there, people I didn't even know were on the ship, I don't know where they came from, they're all there. There's like 100 people. I'm like, hey, I thought that we only had 30 people on the ship. But they're all out to watch this, and all eyes are on the crane operator, and the ship's going like this, and he just times it, and all of a sudden it's like, whoosh, boom, and it touches, and the ship shudders a tiny little bit, but that was it. And they're on deck, and then we begin the long conservation process, which is we wash them off, we keep them in fresh water, and this, I just love this. This is the oxidizer. It's an amazingly cool piece of engineering. But ultimately, they went back into the crates. They were wrapped, and what you don't see here is that they were continually doused with fresh water, so that they wouldn't further oxidize or fall apart. And that was that. So at the end of 2.5 weeks, we went back home, and we brought engines from the Apollo missions back to Cape Canaveral. It was pretty cool. I mean, you got a little bit, you know, the engines were welcomed home appropriately. You know, the news teams were there, and it was really neat. But ultimately, they loaded them onto a truck and shipped them off to, not the Smithsonian, they shipped them out to Kansas, which I had never heard of this place, but it's one of the best museums in the world that I still haven't been to, but I highly recommend everybody go there. It's the Cosmosphere Museum in Cutchinson, Kansas, and it's one of the most amazing space museums. And I can tell you that just by, I mean, I've just gone through and looked at so much stuff online and looked at a lot of the things, and I just watched the work that they've done. These guys agreed to conserve the engines and restore them as much as possible, and that's what they did. So over the ensuing months, they went through, they sprayed them, they soaked them, they cleaned it out with a toothbrush. And those things are pretty big. That's a lot of toothbrushes there. But one guy had a brilliant idea of finding the engine that didn't have any serial numbers on it, and he actually hit it with a black light, and 2044 came out, which actually ended up being the center engine for the Apollo 11 mission. And so at the end of the day, Jeff and everybody did manage to bring home Apollo 11, and it was, I mean, it's still pretty fulfilling. So that's basically the gist of our presentation, and we want to thank everybody for coming, and Don and Michelle and everyone for putting this all together. And just by way of an exit here, this is Richie and I doing another project on the sister ship to Titanic, the Britannic. And that's another presentation, but thank you all for coming, and I think if you have any questions, fire away.
Any questions, anyone?
What other items do you find when you're doing?
Well, the question was, what other items do we find on projects like this?
On the seafloor.
Oh.
When you're down there looking for the Apollo parts, do you ever run across other shipwrecks and things that you don't expect to find?
Well, we find lots of plastic bottles. We always find Coke cans or Coke bottles. You know, occasionally you find random, you know, marine stuff. But to be honest, we find, I think, more human junk. And that's not, you know, sort of maritime related. That just happens to be garbage barges or whatever. So unfortunately, that's a lot of what we see.
We refer to it as site contamination. And even the German submarine that I had mentioned to you, on one of the dives, I was going inside, and I was shocked to find a mylar or plastic balloon with Barney the purple dinosaur in a World War II submarine where it had fallen through the water column and then just got caught up inside the shipwreck. So site contamination is a real problem on many of the shipwrecks, and it's endemic because, let's face it, humans are pigs. We've been polluting our planet for hundreds of years, and now it's coming home to roost. Yes, ma'am?
Is your wife a diver?
Yes, my wife is a diver. I met her on a diving expedition, and she's probably the best thing I brought home from diving. So.
Good for you.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question. What I want you to do is to tell everyone the story of your father and the rope.
Okay, as I alluded to before, my father was an enabler, helping us, all of his children, by encouraging them to try and do different things. And when I was a young boy, he allowed me to use his scuba gear. He only had one set, so we never really got to dive together. So he tied a rope around me and let me go off the back of his boat. And we lived in Brooklyn, New York, and obviously I remember going in the water. The water was murky. There was styrofoam cups and cigarette butts floating on it. And I got down to the bottom, and there was a horseshoe crab. And to me, it was just traveling to another universe. And I've maintained this passion. And a few years ago, my father came out to hear me do a presentation, and I was recanting that story. And all of a sudden, my father raises his hand. And I'm like, well, we're not taking questions now, but I figured he wanted an attaboy for, taking me diving. But he stood up and he goes, don't you know why I put the rope around you? And I go, yeah, because you love me and you wanted me to be safe. He goes, no, if things went sideways, I wanted to get my equipment back. So. That's the truth. Yeah. Do we have time? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Evan mentioned the museum in Kansas, and I wonder where that is. What's the name of the museum, and where is it?
It's the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas. So Hutchinson, Kansas, and and it's the Cosmosphere.
I've got a question. Can you talk a little bit about the ownership? Who claims ownership to all these things, and like the F1 engines and
Sure.
all these wrecks? Is there any controversy about that?
Wow. Yeah. There's the question is who owns a lot of this stuff? I mean, who owns the shipwrecks? Who owns the F1 engines? And then the last part of it was, is there any controversy about that? And I mean, I think we could both stand up here and talk for a week about the controversy.
We could actually do presentations just on shipwreck ownership. The reality is, if it was military or GI government, it's always owned by the government. It takes an act of Congress to get rid of anything that was paid for with your tax dollars. That doesn't mean that the government or the military hasn't just deposited stuff on the seafloor. It has, but it still retains ownership. If it was a war loss, if it was a ship that was sunk either in a storm by an act of war, well, then it's a war grave, like the German U-boat. It was a war grave. Even though that government no longer exists, thank God, the Nazi government no longer exists, we still recognize that it is a war grave, just like the CS Hunley or the Confederate submarine Hunley that was recently. Now, the Navy opted to allow that submarine and its crew to be recovered. But generally, a sailor's grave, like the Arizona, is their grave site, and it is not to be touched. Therefore, you can't salvage it. These engines were government property, and my understanding is that
we had permission from NASA to be able to recover. And just to go over to Titanic, Titanic's a very interesting one because it was found by Dr. Ballard in Woods Hole in the 80s, and they made the conscious decision that it was a tragic site, and they didn't want to claim ownership of it. It's not what Woods Hole really did. So they didn't arrest the wreck. And then shortly thereafter, RMS Titanic Inc. arrested the wreck and began salvage ops, and has started, a mass amount of controversy over the last 30 years regarding that.
With regards to the imaging, particularly of Titanic, starting with Bob Ballard's pictures, including the rest of them that have been collected over the years, and your images, are there plans going forward to routinely image the wreck since it's been looted and it is starting to degrade, to sort of preserve that for future generations?
Yeah, Titanic, one of the things I like to say about Titanic is I mean, no matter what you do there, it's going to throw things right into the spotlight, and it's a great place to go to because it is probably one of the most studied bottom pieces of the ocean that we have. We have an incredible temporal, which I was alluding to earlier, meaning that we've got images going back to 85 and almost every couple of years since then. So we get we can sit there and look at it and get a real sense of how the ship has been collapsing. And so no one has been out there since 2010, since our last mission. There's a lot of things cooking up, and probably over this year and next, there's at least a half dozen groups I can think of that want to go back. But RMS Titanic is also in the middle of a bankruptcy, which then puts the ownership into question, and there's a lot of lawyers that are heavily involved in that. But yeah, no, I want to go back. Just for, like, I put that mosaic in there for a reason, that stern section, because you know, it's very hard to show and to help people understand what something is like on the seafloor in a two-dimensional way. Now, we shot all of that in 3D, and I've got amazing footage of the whole wreck in 3D. But again, that's video, and that's something then I have to sit you down for hours to really watch it for you to be able to really get a sense of it. Now, if I can go and build a model, a 3D model of the whole thing, where you can still get incredible detail, you can drill in, you can go and look at things, but you can also jump back out and get a scale, and see that wreck in a way that you wouldn't be able to even in real life with all the submarines and all the ROVs in the world. You'd never be able to light that whole thing and put it into a single shot. So that's one of the big goals, is to go back out there and model the wreck appropriately. Yes.
During your discussion, you mentioned that you did lose a couple of divers on the German submarine, and seeing how you also have used manned submarines and remote control submarines, what would be the purpose of sending divers down anymore if you can do such incredible work using remote controlled submarines?
Sure. Well, actually, you go first. You actually.
Okay. There is no machine that can tell you what they were thinking or felt experiencing stepping on the moon. And one day, I hope in my lifetime, I'm around to hear someone tell me what it was like to travel across space and look back at a blinking light in the sky from Mars and tell us what it smells like, and tell us what it feels like, and tell us what that journey was like, how he feels or she feels or they feel having made that journey, maybe never to come back, maybe to become Martians. I think that as human beings, our race is born on exploring. Everything that we've achieved as humankind has been to go further. I recently had a tragic injury, and I was speaking to my father about recovery, and my father quoted the play Don Quixote, and he says, if you wish to climb a mountain, you have to reach for the star beyond it. So you have to go further. And although machines are tools, and they're great tools for us to use, I think that as a species, we need to go there. Now, that being said, there's physical limitations. As much as I would love to have gotten out of the Mir submarine and swam around Titanic, physically it's impossible. There's just, at this point, with the technology we have. But if you told me that one day there would be the ability for me to wear a suit and I could do that, well then there's a certain type of person that I believe they have to do that. And I think that's who we are. I'd like to believe that's who we are as a race.
From an exploration and certainly from a filming point of view, I mean, this just gets more true the deeper you get until it just gets beyond diving depth. But I mean, I'm a big believer in using the right tool for the job. And divers, in that sense, are tools. So are ROVs, so are AUVs, so are submarines. So when we have access to all of that and budget for that, then my personal preference is always to send, not always, but most of the time, to have ROVs go down and, you know, set the scene, so to speak, so that as divers and as filmmakers and as storytellers, We're not going down and spending our time going, oh, geez, oh, God, I wish I was over there. That would be a much better shot, you know? I mean, so we'll go down, we'll put the ROV down there, we'll use it as a lighting platform, we use it for safety, we use it to get to the location we want to get to right away. Sometimes that just means, I mean, although I've built some vehicles to go inside of shipwrecks, they're still, it's just not, it's not super efficient, and it can spend a lot of time there, but I think Richie and I are both on the same page that it's never quite the same until you can get down there and put your hand on it and crawl through it and film it. And
a perfect example is what you're looking at here is there's an ROV, there's a diving bell, and there's two divers, and the diving bell is a habitat. It is a place for us to go in case of an emergency. It is a place where we can step up out of the water. Above my head inside is an airspace. But when we were diving Britannic, Evan and I went inside, and we traveled places there no ROV could ever get, because you just can't drag that much cable. And we were in over 170 feet inside a shipwreck, 365 feet down. And we were imaging that shipwreck to try and figure out why it sank 3 times faster than Titanic. And we accomplished that. But we had to put, excuse my expression, our ass on the line. We had to do that. Now, some people would say maybe it's not worth it, but to us, it defines who we are as explorers and as people. And we believe we've got the experience and the skill set to do it and mitigate risk. And I think that ultimately gets to your question, which is about mitigating risk, and also about answering, because I've been spurred on by, obviously my father gave me the light to go into the water, but before him were other explorers like Jacques Cousteau, and then later it would be Bob Ballard, and I hope that someday, I think we both do, that we inspire another generation of younger people to take the torch and go further than even us. And no machine can inspire that as a young person looking up to someone else and saying, I want to be that guy or that woman, I want to go there, I want to do that. So I think that's my answer to your question.
We've got time for one more question.
Oh.
Speaking about the ROVs, the remotely operated vehicle, and the control people on the surface, what is the communication link? Is that a direct link, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, the robot's at the end of a cable, and it is a direct link. It's real time, and depending upon the size and sophistication of the vehicles, you may have a whole ton of different sensors feeding back real-time data. And I mean, we've built some to actually go into shipwrecks that spool tethers in and out, in particular the USS Arizona, and that is the same sort of thing. It's real-time data coming back and forth. It's kind of like if you don't have real-time data, if you could imagine driving your car by your cell phone but being 2 or 3 seconds behind, I don't think it would go too well. So it's kind of like that. Is that done by cable or what? Yeah, so typically you either have a copper or a fiber optic interface. Usually, I mean, nowadays usually a little bit of both, and you've got fairly infinite amounts of data that you can send back and forth.
So
Sure.
let's give Richie and Evan a round of thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Come here, Chip.